Good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to say welcome on behalf of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really, really glad to see the crowd here online today. I am Eric Schluessel, Associate Professor of History and International Affairs and Director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies at GW. The Seeger Center is a comprehensive Asian Studies center for the university and for the DC area Asian Studies community. But one of our special foci is Taiwan and Taiwanese diasporic identities. So I'm just really delighted to have all of you and our speakers here today for yet another event this semester on sort of Taiwanese and Taiwanese American identities. I've been delighted to the depths of my heart to see the success of these events. And I'm really looking forward to today's conference. The Taiwan Education Research Project is a very, very special part of the Seeger Center's programming. And what can I say, but I'm just so happy to have this here today. I will now turn the mic over to a proper expert, Professor Leona Chen, who is Associate Professor of Chinese Language and Literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures at the George Washington University, and one of the co-directors of the Taiwan Education and Research Program. So I will step out and Liana, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schluessel. My name is Leona Chen. I am the co-director of the Taiwan Education and Research Program at GWU. It is my great pleasure to welcome everybody for your participation in this afternoon's event. So the Seeger Center and Taiwan Education and Research Program, we call it TERP here. We have been long-standing hubs for Taiwan studies across humanities disciplines at GW. So TERP was established in 2004 by Professor Edward McCord to promote and support academic and policy-related study and research on Taiwan. And since then, we have expanded our programming to include a lot of different things. So in the recent years, we have supported the creation of the Taiwan Resource Center at GW Skelman Library. And we have also sponsored policy workshops on the Taiwan affairs, humanities lecture series, curriculum developments, and student fellowship programs. The Seeger Center and TERP conducted two very successful Spotlight Program events in the recent years, and this is our third year conducting Spotlight Taiwan series of events. So I'll just give you one example. In 2019, the most recent one is a film screening event. TERP and the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures co-hosted Screening and Staging Taiwan, Multiculturalism and Identity Politics, which included both film screenings and lectures. So today's event is made possible much because of our really hardworking team. So I would like to really thank the core TERP team who really make a lot of effort and their time into making this happen. So Richard Haddock, if you can turn on or wave your hand or turn on your camera. So Richard Haddock is the Assistant Director of the Seeger Center, also the co-convener of this year's Spotlight series of events. Bobby Kincaid, who is Program Coordinator of TERP and the East Asia National Resource Center. Bobby is the one running, thank you for turning on the camera. For running the logistics here. Lisa Lackney, you saw the beautiful slides. Lisa made the slides, and she is the program associate of our East Asia National Resource Center. And of course, David Fong. David, it's your time to turn on the camera. So David is our graduate student assistant. Thank you so much. Now I would like to turn the mic over to my co-director, Alex Joubin. She will introduce and say a little bit about today's event.
Hello and everyone. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Liana. My name is Alice Joubin, and I'm the co-director. I will now proceed to share a little bit of information about the series that supported today's event. The Seeger Center and our Taiwan Center conducted two very successful Spotlight Taiwan events. So Spotlight Taiwan is an annual series that is sponsored by Taiwanese government. In 2017, our university's Department of Theater and National Taiwan University of Arts actually co-organized the cultural exchange through dance program. And there was a final exhibition and performance with artists from Taiwan. In 2019, we co-hosted the Screening and Staging Taiwan series, Multiculturalism and Identity Politics, which included film screenings. And the Spotlight Taiwan this year focuses on the formation and transformation of Taiwanese American identities and the creative works produced by Taiwanese American artists, many of whom are with us here in the virtual room. And they will reflect on their journeys of becoming. Today's event is the final part of the Spotlight series. This virtual symposium allows us to explore Taiwanese and Taiwanese American identities through the multidisciplinary lens of the arts. It features a special keynote, which I'm going to chair, and that's followed by 3 dynamic panels. The entire event will highlight how the arts foster critical and reflexive discourses on identity formation and preservation. So welcome to the keynote event of the symposium featuring Leona Chen. She is a Taiwanese American community organizer, writer, and speaker committed to building on the legacy of Taiwanese American elder activists and serving the multi-generational Taiwanese diaspora. Of note is her 2017 poetry collection debut, Book of Chord, which confronts the shaping of Taiwanese identity through state and family narratives. And I should know she's the editor-in-chief of TaiwaneseAmerican.org. So you're all invited to visit, there's no space, TaiwaneseAmerican.org. You can also follow her work at Leona-Chen.com. Her keynote today is Tai Mei Lina, Growing Up Taiwanese American, or in Mandarin, Tai Mei, child of Tai and Mei. In her keynote address, Leona Chen will chart the formation of a distinctly Taiwanese American space. She will share especially her experience of growing up Taiwanese American, such as attending Taiwanese school, Taiwanese American church, reading Taiwanese American literature, synthesizing Taiwanese and American social issues. And she'll share her observation of Taiwanese Americans' increasing legibility throughout the last decade through mentors from and organizations like TaiwaneseAmerican.org, the Taiwanese American Federation of Northern California, the Taiwanese American Foundation, and others. Leona hopes to offer a narrative of abundant community care, radical storytelling, and the possibilities of intergenerational empathy. So let's give Leona a most warm welcome. I'm going to hand over to you, Leona, and you can take over.
Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. And thank you again to the Taiwan Education and Research Program for having me today. It is such an honor, and thank you all for joining me from wherever you are. So as mentioned, my name is Leona Chen. I am a Taiwanese American writer, speaker, and community organizer. I'm really passionate about serving the multi-generational Taiwanese diaspora, and I truly do believe that with thoughtful education and a really strong community, we can empower transnational solidarity, healing, and peace building. Lately, I've been telling people that my life is like a little alphabet soup of mostly T's and A's, as I've had the privilege of working with organizations like TaiwaneseAmerican.org, the Taiwanese American Federation of Northern California, the Taiwanese American Foundation Summer Conference, and many more throughout my life. All that to say, I was born and raised and work right here in Taiwanese America. Imagine just for a little bit that Taiwanese America is a physical space that we can visit together. And I want to tell you about how it was built, how it became the foundation of my upbringing, and how each of the people living here have contributed in some indelible way, and the role that each of us has now to contribute to its infrastructure and its constitution. In other words, how will all of us decide what Taiwanese America looks like and what we as Taiwanese Americans will stand for? Let's go back to 1996, the year I was born. So two things are of note. One, across the Pacific Ocean just months earlier, Taiwan held its first free and direct presidential election. And right here where we are in Taiwanese America, the people around us have had a part in that, even if they have to do so from so far away. See, the founding fathers and mothers of Taiwanese America had been here for several decades and almost 2 generations at this point. As early as the late 60s, Taiwanese immigrants came to the US as grad students, organizing among themselves as a form of survival. They organized carpools and potlucks. They formed reading groups and went on road trips together. And above everything else, they were deeply creative, thoughtful architects who not only sought to build this community, but to give it a name. The naming of these spaces as Taiwanese student associations, or later in their life cycles, Taiwanese associations, Taiwan Donghyunghui, is central to our founding narrative. The creation of Taiwanese American spaces reinforced and sustained a sovereign Taiwanese identity, even if a sovereign Taiwanese nation could not yet be recognized. It allowed overseas Taiwanese to figure out who we wanted to be, and by extension, what Taiwan could someday become. By putting their hands in the dirt, by doing the intellectual and physical work, they made meaning of spaces like this, and they gave life to our heritage. Let me give you an example. So in some neighborhoods of Taiwanese America, including mine, we didn't go to Chinese school on the weekends. Instead, I went to my local Taiwanese school where the primary language taught was Hokkien Taiwanese, and the textbooks were written by our parents and not the state of the Republic of China. Instead of a Sino-centric curriculum, they taught us a history of Taiwan that began with its indigenous nations. As a student, I learned about Taiwanese manufacturing and dreamed of someday owning a made-in-Taiwan giant bike, which I eventually did. Our choir sang Taiwanese lullabies, protest hymns, and pop songs in equal measure. I learned about the 228 massacre as a very young child and was deeply affected by the ways my elders made this history apparent and alive to me through the shadow that political persecution cast upon their lives, and the ways they sought to bring their stories to light in adulthood. As extracurricular activities, we protested Taiwan's exclusion from the United Nations and the World Health Organization. I came into my voice shouting, "Taiwan Gayu." I say now in retrospect that I maybe had a pretty radical childhood, and some might even wonder if I was indoctrinated with a specific Taiwanese ideology. But my most visceral memories of growing up in Taiwanese America is that I was deeply loved. And I was loved by people who lived out their passions and beliefs, who spoke of them endlessly, who taught me that you can care about a place even if it feels far away, and you can fight for a cause even if it feels impossible. While so many children of diaspora struggle to interpret the silence of a previous generation, I was profoundly blessed with an abundance of storytelling, of many voices desperate to find an audience, and I hope they found an eager and generous one in me. Staying close to my peers and elders and mentors has helped me see that the landmarks of Taiwanese America are not random. And if you look closely, you will find that the things you perhaps take for granted, your Taiwanese American summer camp, your Taiwanese American student group in college, the section in your parents' passport that claims Taiwan as their place of birth. The kind of work poured into making these things possible could move you to tears, and some of their architects are still with us today. We'll continue our tour of Taiwanese America to visit a Taiwanese American church, where the sermons are still delivered in Taiwanese, where the fellowship extends beyond theology to engage in the ministry of being in community, of serving or being served at a potluck, of gossiping or getting help with calculus homework from someone who is way overqualified for that. It is a sacred space, and it is equally a social space. And I know many Taiwanese Americans, even without a religious affiliation or practice, will have strong memories of singing karaoke here or enjoying a home-cooked meal. I also want to acknowledge that a Taiwanese American church like this was the site of political violence just 2 years ago in Laguna Woods. And this too was not random. But in the days that followed, I also saw Taiwanese Americans taking on the work of educating their peers and the public about the specifics of that shooting, because more so than ever, the details of the story mattered very much. And it was important to name the conflict for precisely what it was. Time and time again, paying attention to the details, speaking to the nuance, has been a part of how we as Taiwanese Americans show up even in, or especially in, the aftermath of tragedy. I think next we should visit the cultural institutions of Taiwanese America, our art galleries and restaurants and storefronts. Our movie theaters screen over a decade of work. This year, 2 Taiwanese American documentary shorts were nominated for Academy Awards, Liu Zhang's Island in Between and Sean Wang's Nai Nai and Waipo. But there's also an entire body of work that we take great pride in. There are the original trailblazers, Justin Lin of Better Luck Tomorrow, Jessica Yu's Ping Pong Playa, Patrick Wong, Bang Bang, where the character was explicitly Taiwanese American, documentaries like Love Boat Taiwan, which many of you saw earlier this week. On Netflix, we have The Half of It, Tiger Tail, American Girl, The Brother's Son, and Hulu is about to premiere Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown. Not to mention the Taiwanese American screenwriters and producers and creatives who have contributed to so many other projects in the last few decades. There can sometimes be a cheap and long-running joke in Asian America about how nothing we do is ever good enough for our Asian mothers. But here in Taiwanese America, we reject that notion entirely. And we are so proud to recognize both their merits and the thousands of little ways they have transformed the way we see and talk about Taiwan and its diaspora. And I have a QR code here on the screen if you want to read more about Taiwanese and Taiwanese American cinema on TaiwaneseAmerican.org. I'll pause if you want to scan that. Taiwanese American cuisine too is being defined and redefined, with not 1, but 2 cookbooks currently in circulation dedicated to this specific genre. And of course, I'm talking about Winston's A Taiwanese American Cookbook and Frankie Gau's First Generation Recipes from My Taiwanese American Home, in addition to the growing list of English language cookbooks about Taiwanese food. Our restaurants wield enormous soft power, and many actively challenge the concept of authenticity to instead focus on creating and connecting in new, interesting ways. Many of the foodies in this space recognize that Taiwanese food is deeply political because it reflects the island's layered history, cultural influences, and ongoing identity struggles. I see people like Angie and Tony pictured here from Emeryville's Good to Eat, making these stories apparent through food, how they take the time to nourish and educate at the same time. Food illustrator Felicia Liang is in this group picture as well, but I know you'd rather hear her story in her own words in just a few hours. Also pictured here are Stacy and Willie of the now closed Taiwan Bento, who during the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement provided masks to anyone who was in need so they could continue to protest safely. They were literally and spiritually feeding the hungry, providing for their neighbors and friends. In addition to making a really freaking good pork chop bento, they led our community by example to use food to connect us in ways that met the moment. Our bookstores are also my pride and joy. There is so much more to Taiwanese American literature than the few flat immigrant narratives they used to assign us in school. The landscape of Taiwanese American literature looks so different now than it did 10 years ago. and it will continue to expand and balloon and be so richly full of all of the different ways we have chosen to experience our humanity, our joy, our triumphs, our griefs, or our traumas. And sometimes they will just be fun and decadent. And I feel like that's such a sign of how far we've come and all we have to look forward to. There has never been a better time to be a Taiwanese American reader in the age of Taiwanese American literature. I invite you all to make our canon a part of your reading life. And again, I have a QR code on the bottom right of our Taiwanese American bookshop. I'll pause here quickly if you want to scan that QR code. There is also a really fun material shopping culture in Taiwanese America. For a few years now, we at TaiwaneseAmerican.org have put together a Made by Taiwanese American small business gift guide, and we're actually currently taking nominations for this year's. And as we're putting these guides together, we're often reminded that for us, it's not just about the products. The Taiwanese American influence is not just, a necklace line that has boba motifs or a candle company that has a jasmine green tea scent. The truth is, we see ourselves and our aspirations reflected and realized in these entrepreneurs. And we as Taiwanese Americans can maybe guess at the anxieties and fears and maybe parental pressures they had in making these things happen. And we are rooting for them because their courage gives us hope. And their hustle tells us something about our own future or the vastness and trajectory of our own community. Again, I'll pause here for a bit if you want to scan the QR code, but the next one is coming in just a few weeks. The reason I want us to imagine Taiwanese America as a physical space is not because I'm necessarily interested in defining its borders or qualifying any sort of citizenship, but because I want us to visualize each of us through our works and lives and ethos materially building Taiwanese America, how we will lay down the bricks, hang the paintings, and curate the museums. The symposium today deals with Taiwanese Americans in the arts, and I believe one interpretation of that is that all Taiwanese Americans are necessarily artists, are inherently creative. Isn't it true that we are always actively remaking meaning from where we come from and how we choose to belong? Isn't it true that in the absence of a coherent national narrative, we decide what it means to be Taiwanese? Isn't it true that when history textbooks collapse or dismiss our histories, we can write our own mythology? We can choose our own ancestors. What's more, if official symbols of the state, like flags, like official flowers, like if colors and monuments are so fraught in the collective political memory, then it is the work of poets and writers and artists to prescribe new images with meanings of their own. A national flower is not always a reminder of beauty. A statue is not always of someone to admire. A flag is not always something to salute. So where do we as Taiwanese Americans find beauty, love, and dignity? Who determines these things about Taiwan? I believe the authority belongs to the Taiwanese people, and I see the diaspora engaging in this kind of work all the time with increasing urgency and scale. We as Taiwanese Americans are becoming legible in the national and global narrative because we have done the work for generations now, because we wear our stories outside of our bodies. I see it in fiction, especially as a reader growing up alongside the canon of Taiwanese American literature. In increasing numbers and with a stunning level of tenderness, there are so many writers who are not just writing Taiwanese American characters as descriptions, but they're doing this earnest and difficult work of excavating from their own lives and from the stories of those in our community to put on paper a Taiwanese American context. In recent years, we have worked beyond the appearance of representation to its purpose. We are coming into an understanding of ourselves and our histories. We see them reflected in the longings and limitations of the people that we love. We have become real to each other, and we have become real to others. I see this also in the way we talk about Taiwanese food. in the creative problem solving we do to define it, or else subvert the exhausting expectation to even define it at all. In my lifetime, Taiwanese American has become an accepted identity, an academic concern, and even an aesthetic. For me, it is a personal framework for principled activism, a way to be loudly grateful for those who have made both elements of my identity possible, and to protect it from my descendants. My question to you and to myself nearly every day is, what will we do with this kind of visibility? If we accrue power and influence and capital, what will be their result? How will we together write the Constitution of Taiwanese America? How will we become good ancestors? My own answer to this has varied, as I too am still growing up and discovering myself after a lifetime of eagerly embodying the hopes and politics of my elders. I admit I'm learning to be more generous, to be the welcoming concierge and not the gatekeeper of our community. I have learned that with a history as troubled and violent as ours, the best way to build peace is to work for justice and not vengeance. I'll share in a very vulnerable anecdote. A year after I stepped into the role as editor-in-chief of TaiwaneseAmerican.org, I received a pitch from a grandson of a KMT or Kuomintang veteran. He offered, with so much pride, a portrait of a grandfather that was able to rise through the ranks, the achievements he accrued, and how his success has now cascaded through generations. I was 22 years old when I read that piece and had come from a lineage of people seeking justice against the KMT, with many even calling for its abolition. I had no interest then in sharing my platform with someone so proud to have benefited from the KMT's colonial regime. At the time, I felt the story lacked awareness and was asking for sympathy from the wrong kind of girl. It's been 6 years since I received and declined that pitch, and I think of that moment with sincere regret. I wish I'd been more curious and more sensitive to the reality that none of us choose what family we're born into, but all of us long to be proud of them. What's more, it wasn't my platform to begin with, it was ours. And I did us as Taiwanese Americans a disservice by dismissing some histories instead of inviting them to learn and heal with us as a community. I wonder what would happen if we practiced more curiosity, if we intentionally chose discourse over division. I don't know the answer to that quite yet, but I know that we do not progress as a community when we pretend to be apolitical, when we sidestep nuance instead of leaning into it deeply and thoughtfully. There are more of us now than ever who will say we are proud to be Taiwanese American. I recognize all of the powerful little acts sustained over generations for us to be able to declare this boldly, loudly, and publicly. But if that is our inheritance, what will be our legacy? What will it mean to be proud? Will we be principled? Will we be generous? Will we build a pedestal for ourselves or a bridge towards others? I think everyone is here because we are trying to figure out why Taiwanese American identity matters at all and what the future holds for us and this space. Why does it matter is such a surreal question because anybody else would answer, it matters because it is a part of me, and that would be a complete statement with no footnotes. But identity matters for Taiwanese Americans for the same reasons it matters to anyone from anywhere. We just have something different at stake. There is the fact of Taiwanese American identity, which despite its political tensions, is simply a representation of where you are from and where you are. This is the logic that drives the movement to write in Taiwanese on the US Census every 10 years. It is what you are. It is not inherently a political statement, though it does carry the gravity of a politicized action. We often talk about Taiwanese identity facing a violent erasure, institutionally, diplomatically, in ways big and small. Taiwanese identity is daily conflated with Chinese identity, either by people who collapse the differences out of convenience, or more powerfully, as part of the PRC's willful erasure of Taiwanese sovereignty, identity, and self-determination. But for most people, that is a systemic reason and not always a personal one. And I think that last one, the personal reason, is what gets us to care and to carry on the work. And so there is the implication of Taiwanese American identity. How do you as an individual fill it with meaning? I challenge each of us to take some time to reflect on why it matters to us as individuals, because I think that level of detail and that range of answers is what will keep us engaged in a thoughtful, heritage-based community that you won't dissolve into, a feral pack of soldiers on a hollow Taiwanese nationalist identity. We do not choose what families or histories we are born into. And yet, Taiwanese identity has historically been chosen and not assumed. How do we make sense of that? And how do we move forward with that in mind? The politicization of Taiwanese identity makes it something we have to declare and defend over and over again. We emphasize that we're Taiwanese because we're not allowed to say it at the Olympics. We emphasize that we're Taiwanese because we are aligned to a very young democracy that is threatened daily. The children of Taiwanese immigrants like me, who have memories of being told at a very young age in very clear terms that we are Taiwanese and not Chinese, inherit a very specific logic. We learn that there is an ideology that would deny us this identity, that would deny this nation its sovereignty, that would try to tell us that we are something else. Therefore, you learn a lot about a person who says they're Taiwanese, like how resilient they are, how much they care, how willing they are to lean into its history and its complexities. We as Taiwanese Americans have the opportunity to workshop all of that and figure out a framework for forming identity that reflects how Taiwan has evolved, that acknowledges that we are in a different Taiwan that our parents lived through decades ago. We can do our part to participate in the more healing and restorative and redemptive work for a country and nation still grappling with political trauma. In fact, as we head into the elections here, 2 countries grappling with political and everyday violence. First-generation Taiwanese Americans have taught me so much about how their love and sense of justice has propelled them to do remarkable things. And I think the best way I can honor that legacy is to support work that moves Taiwanese identity forward. And to do that, it has to be more generous. It has to account for changes in circumstances and conditions and ideologies. These are the questions I have committed so much of my life to, and I'm grateful to wrestle with them with you, shoulder to shoulder, right here in Taiwanese America. That concludes the remarks I prepared for today, and thank you again so much for having me. I look forward to continued conversation with the moderators and with you all. I will share my screen again with links to my website, which includes my writing and my email. So if anything I share today resonates with you, or if you have a hot take you'd like to share, please do reach out. I really care about being here with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Leona, for your wonderful talk, truly capacious, and it comes from your heart. It touches me as a Taiwanese who grew up in Taiwan. I especially appreciate your transparency in sharing the experience you had and the lesson that you learned in dismissing, right, someone with KMT Kuomintang background, and how could they possibly be quote unquote, authentically Taiwanese. I must say I've had very similar experiences, and I admire you for your capacity to be able to reflect on that, even sharing that publicly. It's very valuable for all of us in capacity building, community building. You spoke powerfully to the community bonding effect of cinema, Taiwanese American cinema. Here in our center, we just hosted this week a wonderful screening and talk back regarding the documentary Love Boat of Taiwan, right? It's the story of generations of Taiwanese Americans. And you concluded by calling upon us to choose discourses over division. I was taking note and thought that's so beautifully framed and articulated. and to practice curiosity. I believe that those are your words as well. At the end of the day, I believe living under and between the shadows of China and America, Taiwanese American communities and identities have been confronting this effect of double marginalization, neither here nor there. And of course, there's the experience of those of us who would then go to Taiwan and experience reverse culture shock or not fully accepted there. So that's another type of marginalization, since Taiwanese Americans, depending on whom you talk to within Taiwan, they may regard this community with some suspicion, or perhaps that, you know, why are you meddling in our come election time, meddling in our local business, and so on. So it's extremely complex. You speak of a minority community inside the US, you speak of this community's precarious position, I guess, as diaspora subjects in Taiwan. It's a question that crosses the Pacific. So I have the privilege of being able to ask you the first question. We have many questions and comments, no doubt, coming in. I would like to invite everyone to please type in your questions in the chat if you have questions for our keynote speaker, Leona. So my question is, what advice do you have? We are here in Washington, D.C. trying to build Taiwanese American communities. And we did take your advice to heart. We are kind of doing, every year we always have some kind of film event, right? So and this year we had another event beyond boba tea, so it resonate very well with your slide. We had these food commentators and chefs talking about what exactly is Taiwanese food. It's so hybrid a location, right? And the cuisine is hybrid. So how do we define Taiwanese identity? Do you have particular advice for us as a university here, trying to tread lightly? At one point you talk about politics, but Washington, D.C. is a very political place. Unfortunately, there's no way to claim that any event's apolitical. When we host events, we always have to think about potential reaction, not just from Chinese students, but also from China, but also the university itself, who is taking whenever they hear of Taiwan, there's some sensitivity. So these are lines we're trying to tread when promoting, when organizing events, even when thinking about, even ideas. What have been your experience, and what advice do you have for community building?
Oh, I love that question. And I think it speaks to how do we create a safe space to have hard conversations? And I hope the biggest takeaway from sort of my remarks is that I grew up in a place where people made me feel loved, and that empowered me to change my mind. And even now, as I have politics that maybe diverge from my elders, I still feel loved by them. And I think that's something that is important as we build out these spaces. And that's not always like radical or interesting work. It's sometimes slow and silly. And people who make sure that you get home after an event safely are the same people that you will go to when you are wrestling with something intellectually. So I think the soft work of building trust, of building camaraderie should not be taken for granted, and is probably the most fundamental part of being able to have conversations like this. And I think the discourse is important, because I don't think I would have ever broken out of my myopia if I hadn't been in conversation with someone whose history was only on paper diametrically opposed to mine. As an example, I've always been kind of mean and petty about Taiwanese people who identify as Chinese because I wasn't curious about why that was. And I had a conversation with someone recently who comes from a Weisingeron family. And she said, have you ever considered that we didn't think we were allowed to? And it wasn't a form of erasure or oppression. It was self-consciousness that we come from families who have done horrible things to Taiwanese people. And therefore, we didn't feel like we deserved to. And that took all of the edge out of my anger and gave me a whole new perspective on what Taiwanese American look like when we have conversations like that. I think we have to create a culture of grace where you can choose politics that change and differ from your parents or your surroundings. And I hope I'm an example of like changing your mind as you encounter new ways of thinking and new communities. And I think that culture cannot take root when division is invoked as sort of an impenetrable coping mechanism for what happened in the past. At the same time, though, like neutrality is not a fertile ground for this kind of discourse either. So if you are an organization that thinks that it's too sensitive to touch, I don't know if that's productive either.
Most excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that gives a lot of food for thought. We are now officially starting our Q&A.
Greetings. Thank you so much, Leona, for again, such beautiful opening remarks to really set the tone of this symposium and the important work that we're trying to engage in here at GW. So my question is, so I'm Puerto Rican myself, and I actually came into conversation a lot with how I want to relate to my heritage and struggle through actually my engagement in Taiwan affairs. And here at GW, Eric Schluessel leads a fantastic and vibrant Uyghur Studies initiative. And we've hosted several events before that put into conversation different advocacy groups or social movement groups that represent different nations and communities that have to struggle with different institutionalization or other forms of aggression, identity, erasure. I myself, I'm hoping to do more work that deliberately connects Taiwan and Puerto Rico in conversation with each other for many parallels I've sensed between the two. So with that as kind of my foreground of my thinking, I wanted to ask your personal experience as well as maybe professional experience when it comes to building allyships with other communities, with other communities of interest, individuals of interest that may have parallel or similar struggles, experiences that we can elevate and celebrate each other. I do find that at GW, we can try to use this platform to, again, bring more communities in conversation with each other that might not have been able to have a conversation space together. So just with that in mind, I'd love to hear your reflections on that.
Oh, I also love this question. Let me try to answer like the ideological connections and then the interpersonal connections. One is, I think, to find people like you and me and our peers who are doing the same kind of work, because I think that support helps us sustain the energy and heart to move forward. I'll give an example where in the Taiwanese American community, our generations think very differently about what it means to build a meaningful community. And I really struggle with it. I feel very isolated in you know, the difficulty of that. But then reaching out to my peers in the Hong Konger community who have the same kind of experiences, being able to vent to each other has been a very valuable source of comfort and energy for me. So I think being able to talk about the things that we share, the things that are hard beyond the things that are worthwhile, keeps us engaged in the work. And then ideologically, I think being able to share our histories and the ways that we are talked about relative to how we would like to talk about ourselves has also been really impactful. And so we do a lot of reading groups where we will pick the curriculum for, Taiwan, and the Hong Kongers or the Palestinians will choose their reading curriculum, and we'll put them in conversation with each other and we'll try to figure out what are some ways that we can inform each other, what are some ways that we can share without necessarily wanting like exactly parallel tracks. A group I was with recently hosted a series of conversations, and I gave remarks about the parallels between Palestinians and Pingpu activists in Taiwan. And I think it's just about what is the shared hope? What are the tactics that have organized against us, and how do we want to respond together? I'm really looking forward to how you think about Puerto Rican and Taiwanese solidarity. So I hope we stay in touch, and I'm excited to learn more. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely, and will do. Thanks so much, Leona.
Of course.
So we have a question from Shuan Tsai at UT Austin. The question is, could you share any insight on how Taiwanese Americans have integrated into US society? And they're curious about any personal experience as well. As for the audience member, Shuan Tsai is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Government at UT Austin. And their research focuses on political participation among Asian Americans, especially Taiwanese Americans. So yeah, Liana, so Taiwanese American integration into US society.
Sure. So in terms of political integration with US society, there are more and more Taiwanese Americans running for office in different layers of political participation. There's also a lobbying organization among Taiwanese Americans known as HWAPA, the Formosan Association for Public Affairs, that engages within the infrastructures of US politics to be able to advocate for Taiwan. I see a lot of different ways that the different generations have thought about the role that they want to play in the US. Like I think there's an earlier, more conservative generation that founded things like FAPA that are interested in bolstering US-Taiwan allyship, and that's why they want to participate. There's also an ongoing lineage of people who maybe question US imperialism and want to be more critical of what that connection looks like. There's also organizations like the Taiwanese American Citizens League that focus on civic engagement among Taiwanese Americans that are not necessarily tethered to Taiwanese politics, but just take on this community that they've established and use that as a way to better connect and encourage Taiwanese Americans to participate in the civic lives and communities around them. And they're the ones who do things like this campaign to write in Taiwanese on the US Census and also get out the vote. So lots of ways to integrate, lots of ways that those are perhaps in opposition to each other. I think that's what makes Taiwanese Americans so interesting. There's not a single approach for what healthy US-Taiwan relations should look like or what healthy Taiwanese American citizenship looks like either.
Thank you. This is perfect. Since our focus is on the arts and storytelling, so obviously I have a follow-up question about that. In looking at the Taiwanese American films and looking at Taiwanese American art, all these stories over the years, whether within or beyond your TaiwaneseAmerican.org, surely there are many stories, many kind of stories being told about Taiwanese American identity. So what's missing? What do you think? Is there some kind of story or type of stories that are not being told often, but should be told?
Yeah. I would say it's not a question of like missing. I think it's just still being written. TaiwaneseAmerican.org hosts this creative writing prize with author Charles Yu, and we're a couple years deep into it now. And there's so much work being done that wrestles with questions of Taiwanese American heritage and identity in ways that are not perhaps mainstream yet, but are being considered thoughtfully, especially by young writers. Like it's astounding the ways they think about these issues at such a young age. And so I think the response I would give to like what stories are missing is like, what can I do to better bring these to light? If there's something that you are thinking about, you're not sure, like, oh, I don't know if people can relate, write the story and we'll find a way to share it. And I think that's what will make Taiwanese American identity and culturally informed writing and art more meaningful, is that it won't represent just one narrative, it'll represent many. And again, I think that's what prevents us from collapsing into sort of like a unified Taiwanese nationalism, which is not the point. We want to create space for complexities and nuance, and that begins with having more and more voices represented.
Excellent. I really appreciate how you're pushing for intra-group internal diversity, as well as speaking of Taiwanese American community as a diversity issue to more dominant communities. I think this is very much needed in today's world, and I think the nuance you're bringing to this is just admirable.
And I had a number of questions about dealing with the same kind of generational divide. Essentially because in the Uyghur diaspora community, you have youth who've done an amazing job of opening spaces for nuance and complexity and the expression of living identities through the arts, and an older generation that's still very much locked into that policy activism, have to get American empire on board with us mode. And I was sort of curious about your strategies for bridging that divide, but I think you've spoken to that very, very effectively. So I just want to say thank you very much. And this has given me a lot to think about.
Thank you. And it helps to know that we are not alone in this. And I think what keeps us and sustains us is that at the end of the day, they are people that we love, even if we disagree about the approaches, and we care because they taught us how to care. Being in community and choosing not to consider my elders as disposable has really grounded a lot of the way I think about this kind of work. And I'm not always optimistic, but I do always care. And so I'm so grateful to have this space to sort of figure out how can we move forward and how can we embody a movement that does not leave anyone behind, even if we have diverged in some of our tactics and approaches.
Thank you, Eric. I think there are a lot of parallels between Uyghur diaspora and the Taiwanese diaspora, which made me think of the ecology in Washington, D.C., right? And it's a policy town. So when people think or talk about Taiwan here, it's very often through international affairs, policy angle, international relations. And of course, I think a lot of Taiwanese Americans, myself included, we are not happy about that. We resist twice when Taiwan's brought up. It's always in the frame of U.S.-China relation. Of course, that's probably unavoidable kind of geopolitics, but you are doing something that's very productive. You're talking about art, so kind of moving us away from that. But how do you feel about this kind of this tug of war in a larger context, U.S.-China, as if internationally Taiwan can only be understood, it only makes sense within U.S.-China relations? And how do we move away from that? How do we, even when talking about art, very often we get that kind of questions. And I'm someone who does film studies, by the way. So, yeah.
I don't know if we can get away from that framing how people buy into our work, but I also think that we as Taiwanese and Taiwanese Americans can choose to respond to whatever resonates with us in the moment. And most of the times it's not US-China politics. Like if you want to be really calculating, you can ride that momentum and that interest to get more visibility for your work. And maybe that's what will get people to pay attention. But what you have to offer is so much more interesting and complex than that. I really grieve that so much of the oxygen in the room is often sucked up by like war and aggression and the policy and things like that. But I also don't see that as like a fertile space for creativity. And so staying close to what is a fertile space. And I think it's the intellectual questions, it's the soft questions, it's the cultural fabric that is at stake. And I'll say it's very regional. I'm sure a lot of the questions in DC are about policy. I'm in the Bay Area. We do a lot of like tech diplomacy, a lot of semiconductor talk. And I think we can try to recognize all the ways that these connections are, as an ecosystem, helpful, right? Like there is a space for military conversations, a space for tech and supply chain conversations. And we as artists, we have our own lane and we can work together in the building of that Taiwanese America, knowing that, there's a larger vision and we can make it work.
I agree. I think indeed, coming from Bay Area, you're familiar with the parallel issues, right? The semiconductor talk, the focus of Taiwan only matters because of TSMC. It's parallel to what we face here in Washington, D.C. It's a version of that. But there are so many like you out there doing excellent work. I'm thinking of K. Ming Zhang, who's a Taiwanese American poet, right? And then part of the Kundi Man, and how she reimagines realism, I believe, among many other things, and drawing on mythology, kind of mythological elements. I think this is a very fruitful move. The more diverse arts we can have, the better. And Jonathan Hsy, actually one of our moderators, would you like to ask the question yourself? Yeah. Hey, Jonathan.
Sure, Leona, this was such a wonderful talk, and again, I really am vibing with your optimism about storytelling and abundance. I think that is something we really have to keep in mind. My question is also in the chat. I'd just love to hear more, since we're on this topic, about your identity as a poet. What do you feel poetry can do as storytelling on some of these fronts that you mentioned?
Thank you for your question. And also, I think I know your uncle, Dr. Hong, in the Bay Area. Anyways, As a poet, I think something I struggled a lot with was feeling like my work was worthless, because it sometimes does feel like just poetry, and writing has sometimes felt like a meaningless intellectual exercise when, there are people dying and there's real state violence, and the policies that could ensure stability and safety in Taiwan are going to be written in DC and not by poets. And I was also writing Taiwanese American poetry. So when I was writing, I was like, I feel like the target audience for this is like 4 people, and I'm probably related to all of them. And on top of that, it was written in a language that, English, that has sometimes felt hostile to the people that I loved. But as I was writing it and as the people I loved were reading it, I realized that the thing that I wanted most was also the thing that ultimately happened. I wanted to be Schluessel. I wanted to be a good daughter and prove that the things that were given to me by my elders were taken to heart. And in return, people like my mom, like your uncle, felt like they were heard. And again, it just comes down to like, I knew my lane. I knew the work I had ahead in sort of the bigger community. And I was so lucky to have mentors who kept me close to that work, like Ho Chi Tai, who I think it might be in the audience right now. Like, he has a mission statement to build community by empowering individuals. And I was one such individual who was always I was never shamed for caring in the ways that I cared. And that carried me through so much in my life. And even if the tactics I used diverged from what people wanted of me, it was always so helpful that they knew I cared and they wanted me to keep caring in all the ways that I could.
This is wonderful. I believe time is coming up. We have Delphine, thank you, who says that they enjoyed the Book of Court. And we actually have a quick question from Tim Chang here in the chat, which resonates with my own. I translated a Taiwanese playwright play written in Taiwanese into English, and he's someone who insists on actually writing Taiwanese as well, speaking only Taiwanese. It's based in Tainan. And so this brings us to Tim's question: how are the arts, history, and culture in Taiwan? How can that be connected to Taiwanese American arts, history, and culture, or vice versa?
I think one of the ways I've observed that they may be a little bit different, and I've heard this feedback from like lit professors, is that Taiwanese Americans are a little bit more like self-obsessed, and that may be a Western influence, and that we are very concerned with the self, which is not a bad thing. It just is a different thing. Versus, I think Taiwanese literature tends to be a little bit more communal. Something that I've really enjoyed is reading more translated Taiwanese literature lately and being able to compare that with Taiwanese American literature, and just sort of seeing the ways that the subject is prioritized and biased differently. In terms of what connects us, it's like this longing to make sense of something that is incoherent, and the lack of a national narrative that is, cohesive and clean. What do you do? And I think the people of Taiwan are figuring that out, and we are as well. And that's really exciting to be in exchange towards. So thank you for that question. And
Brilliant.
Also let me know if you have Taiwanese lit recs, because I've been reading a lot of them.
Yes, you speak of kind of, it's like an orchestra, different notes, but they resonate and doesn't have to be the same. I think it's beautiful. So wonderful. Thank you, everyone. We're exactly on the dot. We are going to conclude this session, take a little break, but do come back for the next session moderated by Richard. So let's give Leona a hand. Thank you so much.